Hello, everyone, and welcome to Alta Live. This is the digital interview series we do here at Alta Journal. My name is Beth Spotswood. I'm Alta's digital editor, and today I am so excited to welcome you to a conversation with Vauhini Vara. We're going to talk about her new book, This Is Salvaged. She'll be in conversation with fellow author and California Book Club editor Anita Felicelli. A little bit about Vauhini. She is the author of the book we're talking about today, This Is Salvaged, and The Immortal King Rao, a Pulitzer Prize finalist. She's also a journalist writing for Wired, the New York Times Magazine, and others. Vauhini teaches the Lighthouse Writers Workshop's book project and is the secretary of Periplus. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah.
Great. Before I turn it over to Anita, a pitch for Alta. Alta Journal is an award-winning quarterly focused on California and the West. This is our brand new issue. If those of you who are members may have already gotten this in your mailbox, it was just released online yesterday. We sell memberships to Alta for $50 a year. If you join right now, you get 4 issues of Alta, a California Book Club baseball cap, and our Bookstores of the West guide. So please consider joining us for $50 a year. You can join as a digital member for $3 a month, or you can just come to our free events like this. We've got California Book Club, which Anita helps run once a month. That is free. Alta Live every Wednesday is free. A lot of free and wonderful content online, free newsletters. Anyway, if you like Vauhini, if you like Anita, if you think what we're doing here is cool, I do hope you'll consider checking out Alta and joining us as a member. This conversation will be recorded and posted to altaonline.com. It will also be emailed to you along with a link to where to buy This Is Salvaged on bookshop.org, as well as anything else that pops up in Anita and Vauhini's conversation today. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Please do ask your questions there or in the chat, and I will pop back in at the end at about 1 o'clock to ask a couple of questions on your behalf. With that, I am excited to turn it over to Anita and Vauhini.
You, Beth. Vauhini, I'm so glad to be here with you. You know that I'm a big fan of your writing. And this one, This Is Salvaged, is just a really cohesive collection in which the stories are very thematically tied together. I think mostly by grief in different permutations, but also the boundary between self and others, family relationships, and alienation. While it's more sort of intimately drawn and looks at present day life under the estrangement produced by capitalism, it does feel a little like a counterpoint to The Immortal King Rao, which is your futuristic or speculative debut novel, which also dealt with in a more systems novel fashion, tech and disconnection and family. So I know you started writing short stories at Stanford with the novelist and professor Adam Johnson during undergrad, and then you attended Iowa Writers Workshop under Sam Chang. Tell us a little bit about the process of putting this collection together. Like, under what circumstances did you write the stories? Did you know it was going to be a collection when you started?
Yeah, so thank you, Anita. I'm excited to be here. So I learned to write stories in college, I would say, under Adam Johnson and other writing teachers. I minored in creative writing. And then but the stories in the collection, the earliest ones in there are all stories I started in graduate school, which is where I think I kind of learned to hone my craft and write stories that actually were cohesive and functioned as stories rather than as experiments toward learning how to write a story. Because I think my sister passed away when I was in my freshman year of college, and I learned to I took my first writing workshop right after going back to college, my sophomore year of college, and that was the class with Adam. And I think because of that, there was always this connection for me between writing and writing through that grief I was experiencing at the time. And so I think it must be somewhat subconscious, because I hadn't realized this while I was writing the stories in the collection or later kind of compiling the collection. I've noticed it more only as people other than myself have read the stories and talked about it. But it's true that this question, this theme of grief, and also like grief sort of broadly defined, like people wanting to have one another close to them and being unable to for whatever reason, whether it's because of the death of somebody or like a rift of some other kind, is something that is present in like maybe all of the stories. And I think that might have something to do with like just like what was going on in my life as I learned to become a writer and what I learned to sort of associate that short story form with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Did you have a good time at the Iowa Writers Workshop? Like, did you feel yourself sort of developing, or were you always kind of interested in similar things? And so the stories that were new later actually had seeds in the early writings that you produced for.
Oh, that's interesting. I think the latter is true. I think sort of like thematically and also just like in terms of craft, I think everything I was writing up until, you know, I started the writers workshop when I was, I guess, like 26 or 27, was like moving toward the same stuff, but I just didn't know how to like pull it off yet. I will say that because I think a lot of people have had all kinds of varied experiences at the Iowa Writers Workshop specifically, and I loved it. Like those were two of the best years of my life. You know, that's a program that like has kind of decent funding, pretty good funding for graduate students, and there are a number of programs like that. But like to be able to get paid to just write your own creative work for 2 years, like I think, I mean, it was a great experience all around. And I think like just that in itself, like that basic fact that all I had to do was write and talk about writing and be in community with other writers for 2 years. And they were going to pay me to do it is like sort of all I needed, I think, to be thrilled.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so. One of the stories, the first one that I read years ago, is the O. Henry Award winner I, Buffalo, which is set in San Francisco and narrated by an alcoholic lawyer whose sister and brother-in-law come to visit with their daughter, who the narrator was previously close to. And she and her sister, I guess, have switched places in terms of potential and achievement. She has had this kind of downfall with an affair at work. And there's a strong sense that the narrator feels her selfhood is on a different trajectory than her sister's family. So the story, I think, actually gains its power from not just the emotions that the characters feel, but also this haunting repeated image of the buffaloes in Golden Gate Park. Tell us a little how you came to this particular story and what drew you to those buffaloes.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, you talked at the beginning of our conversation about like the ways in which this collection is similar to or different from the novel. And like this story is an example, I think, of a piece of writing that is on its surface really different from the novel, which is sort of like a speculative, a big book that spans a lot of time from like 1950s India to this speculative future in the US. This is like this small story set in San Francisco, like mostly taking place over a day of this woman's life. But the reason I mention that point you made about the stories in the novel sort of like being in some ways different, in some ways similar, is that I think like thematically I meant for both of those pieces of writing, which I was sort of like working on around the same time, to be partly about the kind of like the societal decay that takes place in under capitalism. And I think so in this story, I, Buffalo, the main character at one point goes to that bison paddock in Golden Gate Park, and is looking at the bison and feels like a kind of connection or kinship to them, like something is attracting her to them. And that's set within the context of this woman, the main character, having a job as a corporate lawyer. She's just left. She's just been fired from her job as a corporate lawyer, like representing landlords whose buildings are full of asbestos, you know, which was not random, you know, it was intentional that like she has this job. She's been a kind of like, as a child, she was an upwardly, she was an ambitious kid. As an adult, she was an upwardly ambitious adult. She loses her job, and it's all part of this sort of like trajectory of collapse, sort of according to like the formal social order. But then she sees these bison, and I think they reflect to her something that's like a different kind of order, right? Like a different not a different kind of order, but like a different way of considering meaning from the sort of like mainstream way that we conceive of it within capitalism. Um, and so I forgot where I was going with that, but so that was what I was interested in. You know, I graduated college and I immediately went to work as a business reporter at the Wall Street Journal, which is like my experiences in that job informed the novel, obviously, but I think also like graduating college and going immediately into this like 9 to 5 job, writing about business people and like writing within this kind of corporate context or for an audience that was a corporate audience, I think also like made me interested in like what that way of like framing meaning was and how it compared to other ways people potentially can.
Did you ever have a sense that you weren't going to pursue sort of business reporting and tech reporting? Was that always something that you were interested in, or you came to that later and it sort of spoke with your fiction accidentally?
Yeah, it was sort of an accident. I mean, when I was in college, I was like interning at news. I cared about, and still do care a lot about journalism. I was like interning at newspapers and working on the school paper, spending a lot of my time at the college paper, but I was also minoring in creative writing. So sort of like the two things I was spending all my time doing in undergrad were creative writing and journalism and editing, like all those things at the same time. And when I graduated, I got an internship. Like I just got another report journalism internship at the Wall Street Journal. And then next thing I knew, that had turned into a job. And so like without what it felt like was a lot of agency on my part, suddenly I was working as a business reporter covering Silicon Valley, covering the tech industry at like this kind of interesting, exciting time. But I did miss writing stories during that time. Like I wasn't getting a lot of time to do it. And so I did that for 3 years. And that's when I went to grad school. And so like the stuff about the tech industry started to really inform that novel I was working on, and also the stories, but in the case of the stories, like in a more subconscious way.
Right, because iBuffalo really, it's set in San Francisco, but it's not overtly about a tech-based San Francisco, because back then San Francisco wasn't as driven by technology as it is at the moment, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And you kick off with this other story, which is also about grief, and it's about adolescent girls who become telemarketers, and they're working with this guy that maybe has some pedophilic tendencies, but it's not clear, who's branching out into phone sex. And that one focuses on sort of the unexpected, and it stylistically emphasizes what's funny and gross about various situations, even though it's primarily a story about the grief one of the girls feels about losing her brother. And the narrator is very attentive to bodily fluids and smells, and that attention on the body in the present day of the story kind of continues on through the collection. And to a lesser extent, I saw once I read this collection, I saw, this kind of connects actually a little bit with Immortal King Rao. Mm. And I know that may not, the bodily stuff may not have been something you thought about all that consciously, but, what do you think that an unusual degree of focus on the immediate condition of a character's body allows you to explore in your fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can talk about that on a couple of different levels. One level is that it is not something, I mean, it seems ridiculous now to say, because it's so, when people have pointed it out, I've been like, oh, right, like that's all over the collection. But that's one of those things that like I was not aware of as something that was present in the collection. Hannah Rivers had this really interesting review in High Country News of my collection that focuses entirely on that. And when I read that, I was like, wait, what? Like this is my book has bodily stuff and it's gross. Oh yeah, I guess it is. So that's like the most basic level on which to answer the question. Another level though, like if I am to like approach the book a little bit as more as a reader than as a writer, and kind of like understand what's happening in it. The book is a lot, as you said earlier, about like the borders between oneself and others, like other humans, the outside world. And like the way in which those borders can also be dissolved. And so I think necessarily any book that's concerned with that, like, is going to become concerned with like the ways in which even the body itself is sort of a nebulous thing, right? Like we excrete fluids and we have like dead skin that sloughs off and like mucus comes out of our body, right? And like we have hair that is like on part of us, but then not, right? And so I think like there's an extent to which that there's like a sort of metaphorical role that like talking about those aspects of the body can have in a book like this, given its concerns. And then I think also just, I think also speaking on a metaphorical level, given that this book is concerned with, and in that story in particular, where these two girls are working in this telemarketing place, and one of the girls' older brothers has just died. Like in that story in particular, for example, the story opens into this place where, into this like sense of decay that this girl and her family are feeling after the death of her brother, which is made again on a symbolic level, sort of like made physical by like signs of sort of physical grossness, physical decay. It's like, and I think the idea in that story has something to do with the way in which like it can almost feel gross, like almost feel obscene to be alive and to be human in a world in which, you know, some humans with whom we've been close are gone, like they're just not here anymore. And so then our existence starts to like take on this sort of grotesque nature. And so I think like in that particular story, that was how it was playing. But there are other stories in which I think like that metaphor is working in different ways.
Right. And I think like it's interesting you say that, because the connection between the bodily stuff and siblings seems to me very close, because you know your sibling sort of experiences like your parents, whatever your grosser younger stages go through, right?
Totally.
And so, yeah, and your dedication is to your sister, and I'm so sorry, I passed away from cancer many years ago. So what has the relationship between writing about siblings in these stories and kind of reliving different permutations of this very profound sense of loss, this life experience, what has that been like? Is it painful to relive that in some sense when you write these short stories, or does the ability to articulate those feelings or explore those feelings through fiction make you feel maybe a little easier with that grief, or have a different relationship to that grief?
Yeah, for me personally, it's something more like the latter than the former. I think this is true of a lot of writers, or like maybe just a lot of humans, even those who don't identify as writers. But like there are things that like I'm never trying to like explain the loss of my sister to myself. But there's something that can be useful about like literally just trying to describe a thing that happened, right? Like what like in general, I think as writers to like try to describe something about what life is like for us is kind of the project in general. And for me, this is a big aspect of my past, my history. And so it was and continues to be something that's really formative for me. And there are things for which, and this is one of them, like it can be hard to find words, you know? And so being able to like write into that space and try to explore it, not like try to find answers, maybe try to find answers, but not actually get the answers, I think is like, have found to be, I mean, like the cheesy word probably is therapeutic, you know? But yeah, it has served that purpose.
You don't, but you don't dwell in it like as if it's purely a melancholy experience within your stories, even though it may be in real life quite a different feeling. In fact, like your epigraph is Laurie Moore, who's a very funny writer, and from one of her well-known stories, it's ha 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 ha, where the ha sort of takes on a different resonance, you know, by the full page of ha's. And so from that, you know, I think in connection with Immortal King Rao, your dad said in this very relatable immigrant dad fashion, oh, it could have been funnier.
Yes.
So where does your sense of humor in this collection come from? Was that sort of irreverent outlook encouraged in your family, or something like a coping mechanism, or something else?
I don't know. I mean, I think just as a human in the world, like I gravitate to where when I read, like I like things to be shot through with humor or irreverence or silliness or or absurdism or surrealism, like things that sort of like shed light on like the randomness, right, of like what we're living through, and also just that are funny and make me laugh. And so as a reader, I'm drawn to that. Like in Friends, I'm drawn to that. I can't remember. I wouldn't say that like I came from a family that was like particularly into like cracking jokes or whatever. I don't know that that was necessarily true, but like the opposite wasn't true either. But I'm not from like a particularly funny family, I wouldn't say. But I think like oftentimes I think as writers, like we infuse into our writing experience like the things that we love as readers, and so I think that's part of it. I do think with that epigraph, funny story about that epigraph. I just like I thought it might be if I can like hold it up and maybe people can see what that is, like what it looks like. But like this is what it looks like on the page. And it starts, in the end, they'd made her laugh, and then ha 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 with exclamation points after each one. The context for that is in the story, Lori Moore's story, Real Estate, it's like it's about all these affairs her husband is the character's husband is having. And it's just like so overwhelming, so ridiculous, like funny on a level, and also funny in that way where like you're so upset you start to laugh, right? It's all those things at the same time. And in the story, like the ha's go on for like several pages. And in originally with this epigraph, I had it go for the full page. And then right before we had to like finish doing everything with the book, somebody wrote to me, I think my editor's assistant or something like that wrote to me and was like, so it turns out like fair use covers only X number of words and we can't have the whole page unless like, do you know Lori Moore? Can you just ask her? I was like, no, I don't know Lori Moore. And we didn't have that much time and I was busy. I was doing other things. And so I just like asked what the actual word count was and they told me the number and then I counted up all the ha's to get to that number. And that's why the epigraph isn't a full page. All of which is to say, that's a digression. But my point is that like, I think like humor can like be a really rich, like it doesn't represent just, haha, this is funny, right? Like it can like tonally be doing a lot, including be a vehicle for tragedy.
I think that's true. And I think it's very successful in this collection, especially because it's juxtaposed with these really serious things and just kind of gives it a complexity that's very interesting.
Thank you.
In the title story, This Is Salvaged, the protagonist is an artist who makes an art installation that he hopes people are going to touch or respond to, that they're going to feel so compelled by this art installation that they'll touch it and change it or ruin it. And he can't tell them that because the instruction defeats sort of the organic effects that he's hoping are going to occur as a result of that touching. And the story and collection as a whole have sort of a number of these instances of trying to connect with people that fail or connections that are fragile or damaged. Like, how much do you think your interest in writing fiction about connections and lack of connections was deepened early on by, interviewing, say, Mark Zuckerberg, or seeing the rise of social media companies? They promised us greater connection and sort of in certain respects, especially I think for immigrants with family in other countries, delivered, but in others, because of the algorithm's tendency to promote like sort of blunter or less nuanced emotions than fiction does, turned us into a series of disconnected niche communities or, very angry, siloed society, less connected society.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that has happened. I think that there is a strong relationship between technological capitalism and then also like the phases that came before that, right? Capitalism in general, all the sort of growth oriented phases that preceded capitalism, just ownership society in general, right? But it's gotten more pronounced certainly recently. Have all sort of led us to this place in which relationships have been fractured because people leave the village or city of their birth for work. People are asked to have more fidelity for their company than for their family, right? For all kinds of different reasons. Uh, families and relationships have been fractured. And I think that my novel looks more broadly at like the forces that make that happen. And this story collection, you're right, is like more focused on, like, it takes a sort of narrower, what is it, like just a narrower lens, I guess, on the sort of fallout of that. But yeah, I mean, I do like that sort of like in the background for me, for sure.
Let's talk a little more about like sort of that fraught relationship between, humans who are messy, as we see in your collection, and they're
Yeah.
embodied and surprising, and then this technology that gets trained on past data, which is sort of subject not only within your fiction, but also your nonfiction.
Yeah.
And yeah, I read your Believer piece and I was very curious about it. You were trying to write about grieving your sister and trying to see what an earlier iteration of Chat GPT would make of it. And each time it wasn't quite right. It wasn't articulating the feelings that you had. But the more commentary you put in into the interface or whatever, the smarter it became, until eventually it did write something you found moving. And in the Wired piece about writing the Believer piece, you wrote, it often heard the argument that AI could never write quite like a human, precisely because it was a disembodied machine. And yet here was as nuanced and profound a reference to embodiment as I'd ever read. Artificial intelligence had succeeded in moving me with a sentence about the most important experience of my life. So tell me a little bit about that, because your views on generative AI and writing as both a fiction writer and as a technology reporter are really interesting and nuanced, I think, and would be interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the discourse around AI these days, like, has like fixated, not all of it, but a lot of it has fixated on this question of like whether AI can write well and can move us and can impress us. And like the easy answer to that question, I think, is like, no, it can't. Like, here's an example of like a stupid sentence an AI wrote. Haha, look at how terrible AI is. But in my experience with that essay, in which I was sort of like co-writing or duetting with this predecessor to ChatGPT in writing an essay about my loss of my sister and my grief, it's like, in my opinion, some of the best lines of that essay, the best lines of the essay, were written by the AI. And so I think that's like a more difficult starting point, right? To think through like what that means then for us. Like, what does it mean if like an AI can write better than me, right? If like that's the case I'm making. And where I've landed on that, and it was confusing for me for a long time. Like, it felt hypocritical to me for a long time to have written that essay and stood by it and then also feel yucky about AI. And so I wrote this Wired essay as a way to kind of like think through that. And where I landed was in feeling that, like, no matter how much something the AI writes moves me or impresses me, like, it's still not me. It's still not expressing my own perspective, which is why in that essay, and it's sort of like confusing unless you read the essay, but like in that essay, every time the AI writes something, I go back and delete it and sort of like write my own words about what happened. And the essay is sort of like 9 different iterations of me doing that. And the reason I did that is because, like, as good as the AI's writing eventually got, like, it still wasn't me. And therefore it was like moving and impressing me in my capacity as a reader of its words, but it wasn't moving and impressing me as a writer. Like, I don't even know what that would mean, because I wasn't engaging in the process of writing that's necessary in order to like get the satisfaction that you get from being a writer. And so that's where I landed. And I think that's the reason that since that experiment, like, I haven't had that much interest in like using AI to try to write creatively in that way. Like, I've done other kinds of experiments, but like not with the goal of like uncovering something that's like emotionally valuable for me.
Yeah. You had also tried out pseudo write, I think, which allows you to kind of mimic styles and strategies of other texts. And that one, I think you used iBuffalo, right, to test it out, and it ended up with this redemption arc that's not necessarily in this story at all.
Totally.
And so, like, what do you think that's about? Like, do you think there's a certain predictability maybe to the AI that's different than the creative process of sort of coming to the page and sort of seeing what sparks in your own mind?
Not inherently, but in the way these tools are being built, because these tools are being built by big tech companies and they want their tools. They don't care whether like somebody's writing a beautiful story using their tool. Like they want it to be very widely adaptable so that they can make a bunch of money, right? Or so they can change the world broadly. So that is maybe how they would frame it. But so like an AI, in order to be good at that, like basically they want their AI to be a really good chatbot. And a really good chatbot is predictable, is agreeable, all these things that are good for chatbots and really bad for creative work. Like you don't want predictable writing, you don't want agreeable writing, you don't want happy endings. I mean, maybe you do, but like you don't want like obvious happy endings, right? Like you don't want like the most straightforward redemption arc, right? And so yeah, when Pseudo-Write produced that, it reflected, I think, like what these companies' goals are in actually building these products, which isn't like to build a beautiful story, which in some ways maybe is good for us as writers or as critics, right? Like we're not first on the list of like people they're coming after.
That's probably a good thing, except I think like there's a pretty big sort of copyright issue occurring now. But
yeah,
speaking also of that connection and sort of the possibilities of deeper connection than what technology allows, like hopefully the connection that fiction allows us. You're the founder and secretary, I think, of Periplus Collective, which mentors writers of color. And if I'm remembering correctly, it's been some years, you named it that because you were an extremely successful spelling bee competitor, and Periplus was a word you missed in the spelling bee.
yes, wow, yeah, good reporting.
So I know you felt you personally had many mentors of color in a more organic process, and what gave you the idea to do that work of pulling together authors to facilitate those connections and intentionally serve as mentors rather than leaving authors to kind of flail around and find their own mentors in a more, whatever the natural progression for them is.
Right now, by the way, I'm putting in the chat a link to Periplus's FAQ, which also links to the application for anyone who's interested. The deadline is October 27th, also in the chat. So I benefited from having like all kinds of mentors of color, female mentors of color as I was becoming a writer, like as early as high school. It was never an issue for me. And it didn't occur to me that that was special until I became an adult and like had other writer of color friends who were like, that's not what I experienced, and still, I'm 41 and like I still meet peers who are like, I've never had a mentor of color or a female mentor, let alone somebody who's both, right? And I've had multiple ones. And so I think that discrepancy is what made me think like, oh, well, this was like a very valuable thing for me. I wouldn't be where I am in my career artistically or professionally without having had that. And so like, not to be glib about it, but in some ways I was like, oh, well, so there's like an easy fix, right? Like, let's just get a group of people together and like try to create a space in which that can take place. The part that surprised me was that I had conceived of it, I had thought of it, or my friends and I had thought of it as like a mentorship collective where like we were providing mentorship to emerging writers. But what's most valuable about Periplus these days is that the mentees themselves, which are called Periplus Fellows, have their own, they've like created their own vibrant community, and they're responsible for like a lot of like the community building and support that makes Periplus effective.
It's really exciting to see. I think we had talked earlier about sort of seeing different, Indian American writing getting published, for example. And I think it's due to efforts like that, like sort of grassroots efforts by people who come through and help other people who are following behind them. And so that's really exciting to see. So I'm going to bring Beth back so she can ask questions from the chat if there are any.
There are. I just have a couple. We've gone a little bit over, but this is so great. First of all, great conversation, Anita and Vauhini. Thank you so much. I know we've got a lot of people excited to read this book. Question from Julia Flynn-Seiler, noted author herself. Yeah. Vauhini, do you have to unlearn some writing habits or conventions that you'd learned as a Wall Street Journal reporter?
Yes. First, I would say that I think having been a Wall Street Journal reporter served me more than it hurt me. Like there were many things that I still rely on that I learned then. The biggest one being following deadline, like meeting deadlines, like having a sense that like there's a job to do and you're going to sit down and do it. And you're not going to like, be fussy about having to have like your special cup of coffee or your special desk. Like you're just you need to finish it. And so you do it. Like that was huge, as Julie seems to agree in the chat. However, I think in newspaper reporting, I'm not blaming the Wall Street Journal specifically, but I think there's like a shorthandy reliance on like what you could describe as like conventions of communication, but could also ungenerously describe as cliches, right? Like cliches of language, cliches of form, which work well in a reporting context, because I think like people come to a newspaper, especially you'd like to read about something newsy, just like wanting to get the information, wanting to have like some expectations fulfilled about how that information is going to be given to them, but is not useful in creative writing, where you always want to, I mean, for me at least, I always want to be kind of subverting expectations on the language of level of language, which means like not using cliches, but also like on the level of form, on the level of plot and character and all of it. And so I think like a big one that comes to mind is that I had to train myself to like not go for like that easy cliche defined broadly of language or whatever, and rather like find a more interesting way to say everything I wanted to say.
Yes, Julie hears you. Last question for you, Vauhini. We have some Alta Live regulars who you are a new author to them. Do you have any recommendations in terms of kind of like diving into your work? Do they need to start with your first book? Can they dive right into This Is Salvaged? What do you recommend?
So while I think the books like have a lot in common in terms of what they're interested in, they're pretty different books. Like I think of them as maybe like obviously appealing to different kinds of readers. So like I'll describe those two readers, and Lynn, you can decide which one you are. This Is Salvaged. It's stories. It's like these are intimate stories about like really focus on personal relationships. They're funny. They're also sad, but they're funny. I think like the headline is more funny than sad somehow, even though they're about grief. The Immortal King Rao, my novel, is like much more of like what you might describe as like a social novel or a systems novel, that's sort of like talking more explicitly about like the sort of societal forces that got us to where we are now, and think and to where we might go in the future. That said, like it's also like an adventure story. So if you like like adventure shows or adventure books, or systems novels or social novels, like you might prefer that one. I don't know, Anita, you've read both. Does that feel like a decent distillation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. They could also, and you have a nonfiction book coming out soon too, right?
Yes.
What's next?
It's a book called tentatively called Searches, and it's essays, including that essay Ghost, and including the essay in Wired about writing Ghost, that sort of like circle around these same themes of like identity and community and family, but like with a very explicit technology lens.
With that, folks, I am so grateful to This Is Salvaged author Vauhini Vara for joining us today. My fabulous, beautiful colleague, very talented also, Anita Felicelli. Thank you so much for moderating today's Alta Live. Folks, before you go, you obviously love books. You're going to love our new issue that includes a holiday book guide of 126 books by Alta contributors. All of them have these great books. And the next month, all of October, is our Writers on Writers series in celebration of this issue. So next Wednesday, we've got Bold Voices, authors Miriam Gerba and Hector Tobar in conversation with each other. Following that, poets Tyee Tibble and Forrest Gander, again, in conversation with each other. Then we go noir on October 18th, Todd Goldberg and David L. Yulin. And finally, Second Novels. That's Thursday, October 26th with C. Pam Zhang and Lydia Kiesling. So you can sign up for all of those at altaonline.com. We will send you invitations. Again, thank you, Vauhini. You'll get a video of this as well as a link to buy This Is Salvaged. And with that, I wish you well, and I'll see you next week, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Vauhini and Beth.
Thank you both so much. Thanks, Alta. Bye.